During the last week of June, my girlfriend and I decided to take the dogs on a long walk. We were driving up the coast, planning on a beach walk, when I decided to go to an area on Redwood Creek where my friend had heard some unusual and scary whistles and screams. He is a very experienced hunter and outdoorsman with a degree in wildlife biology and had never heard anything like it. Anyway, we were walking up the north bank, where the trails are, when I decided to cross to the south bank to check out some sandbars. I loaded up my girlfriend on my back and waded across the water. We then continued upstream a short ways when we came across 3 distinctive footprints. They were approximately 14.5 inches long. I measured them with a stick that I saved. I compared them all with my own barefoot track for depth, and they were nearly twice as deep. I weigh about 280 pounds. I was surprised they weren't wider. They were almost narrow for their length. I at first thought they were human because of this. The best print had 5 very distinct toes and was flat. No arch at all, with toes straighter across than a normal human. It appeared that it had just leisurely walked into the creek. I scoured up and down for an exit point, but the terrain wasn't suitable for tracks other than the odd sandbar. The strides were about 4 feet. It had come across a packed gravel bar, leaving a few faint impressions. Nothing else that I saw. In 1978, I was alone and gold hunting up behind the Hoopa Valley Indian Reservation. I had to take a side trip across the mountain to avoid some heavy snow and brush. I found this trail that was going up the mountain, where there were large steps in the trail that were throwing my climbing stride off. At this point, this side of the mountain that I was on was bald, and it was open ground with no trees or brush close by to hide behind. Suddenly, I had this very bad feeling. Then the hair on the back of my neck stood up, straight up. I never had that happen to me before or since. I believe this happened for no other reason except fear. I then left this out of stride trail. Actually, I ran off the trail, feeling terrified of something that was coming down the same trail. I only got a short way off when I went down on my knees and covered my face and eyes with both hands and tried to hide. At that moment, I heard an animal on 2 legs come down the trail, just a few yards from me. It stopped, and it had to gaze right at me for a while. Then it continued on down the hill. I didn't look until after it left and continued on down the mountain out of sight, so I never saw this animal. I believe this creature was directing a silent feeling toward me, and I complied. At this point in my life, I had been a seasoned mountain man and have had numerous encounters with many kinds of animals, including bears and deer, day and night, but nothing like this. With no more fear, I returned to the trail feeling fine. I thought of Bigfoot right away. This time I paid close attention to detail. There was no odor or smell, and the only odd thing was that the trail became fainter as I continued to climb up on this mountain. I had expected this trail to lead somewhere, like a cave perhaps, but no, it just ended at a small meadow. I looked all around, and I could see there was a limestone ridge outcropping in the distance, but no signs of a cave. This encounter was really something to remember, and it was just my experience. There isn't any need for the so-called experts to tell me anything. They will just have to get their own experience. Besides, it's not like they're in the loop. Last July, 2018, I was staying in a very isolated region, which had very limited access, behind 3 locked gates and 20 miles south of Whitehorn, California, on a primitive 4x4 road. This place is at the end of the world, on the northern border of a vast green belt spreading from Shelter Cove on the coast, east to Highway 101, and south to Fort Bragg, and east to Piercy, as can be seen on Google Earth. At about 3 a.m., I was awake. It was a hot and dark night in these mountains. Something above my tent location, approximately 200 to 300 meters, began knocking on wood, best described as loud whacks on a tree trunk by a big club or branch. It started with one knock, which got my attention. with a brief hesitation, then several more knocks, but randomly timed, some in succession, others after hesitations. The knocking was loud, so loud that it echoed down the canyon. The event lasted only a minute or two. My first thoughts were that there was no one on the mountain who could be out here in the middle of a primitive and protected area. These knocks were obviously from something large, and no North American animal could have made them. I listened intently while my mind tried to wrap around how the noise was made. The woods were silent, not even a cricket. I told a few locals afterward and learned that there were other hot spots for squatch sightings between Piercy and up to Willow Creek. Flash forward 2 weeks ago, when waiting at the first lock gate to the same conservation area, I heard two distinct vocalizations which cannot be explained. As I waited in the dusk for about 45 minutes, waiting to meet a party at the gate who were running late, I heard a very loud wailing, screaming sound that I've never heard before in nature. The call of this thing I located at about my 2 o'clock, facing east and up the heavily wooded area above me, about 200 to 300 meters. I instantly knew where I had heard such an unfamiliar call. About 3 years ago, when watching a Bigfoot reality show, where these squatch hunters were making this strange, unique call while searching for Bigfoot. There was a few second delay from the first call, then a few more, then silence for about a minute, leaving me to wonder if this whole experience was real, pondering what I know about the wilderness. Either that was an unknown animal, or some kind of implausible prank. It was loud, echoing down the mountain, as though some huge creature could belt like that. The lungs of Pavarotti, only much louder. The chance of it being a prankster waiting in silence with me for 45 minutes in that remote location, just to hang out in these impenetrable woods and prank me, went away very quickly when another call at about 300 to 400 meters to the north of the first, approximately to my 8 o'clock. It was also just as loud, just as unique as the first, but came only 3 calls in succession, with a distinct higher pitch. This absolutely blew my mind, because the first call might be an elk on steroids, but the response from what was clearly not an owl brought chills down my spine. This was some kind of communication between two individuals, neither which can be explained by any rationale. I must tell you that I have trekked and lived in remote areas in Africa, Australia, Central and South America, many places of potential danger, and never had an inkling of fear. I was born and raised near Yellowstone Park, with 100 times the average distance trekked by most individuals in their lifetime, and never had bad experiences with grizzly, mountain lions, and wolves. Traveling all these years with a firm understanding of ecosystems, I never could have believed in such mysteries, that anything new would ever be discovered. I had a fourth experience, which I must say something about, but it happened just the night before the dual vocalizations. On Friday evening, November 1st, 2019, I had just moved into a cabin that my brother and I rented, located along an extremely rugged canyon area of the Mattole River. It was dusk, quite dark already in the forest. I was outside looking at the stars, taking in the newness of these rugged surroundings. Up above, again about 300 meters up and to the east of the river, there was a screaming that was so loud and so foreboding that I could only listen in amazement. It was the loudest screaming I've ever heard. So loud I thought it was produced by some kind of banshee from a horror film. The screams continued, full throttle, for over 5 minutes. I know mountain lions can scream, but nothing like this. It sounded much louder, more guttural, literally as if somebody had set up a loudspeaker and played the bloodiest scream that Hollywood could produce. At the time, the night after Halloween, I wondered if somebody was up on the mountainside pranking me as a newcomer to the neighborhood. I listened for a bit, then went inside and told my brother about it because it was just so unnerving. Bigfoot did not even enter my mind. But then at dusk the next evening, I witnessed these 2 calls waiting at the gate. I have since been over and over in my mind, why have I been so lucky as to hear or experience such a mystery? much less 3 distinct vocalizations which cannot be explained. I began poring over USGS maps and satellite imagery to ascertain with what link may be, 20 miles apart. Are there any people or neighbors or access for individuals in the areas I experienced which may explain these? Could one individual in such obvious stress on one night have triggered the coincidental travel of at least 2 or more unknown creatures the very next night? I have talked to many locals about hearing strange noises, but no one claims anything, or they don't want to be ridiculed. Look, I am a man, 60 years old with extensive wilderness experience in forests and jungles, all over the world. The closest thing to a new species discovery for me was the Costa Rican jungles, but my mind has always been a skeptic observer, dealing in evidence-based biology as a science. What has happened to me recently has completely changed me. There is a mystery in these woods, and I have a few ideas how to answer them. I am the manager of the Visitor Center at Jedediah Smith Redwood State Park. During the winter of 2001 to 2002, my family and I were the camp hosts at the park and lived in the park full-time. One evening in mid-December of 2001, I and my 2 children, ages 11 and 10, were in our travel trailer reading when we heard a sound that made us cower. It was something between a human cat call and a cow mooing, a kind of "ah-oo" that just echoed through the woods. I have served as a naturalist for the California State Park System. I have hiked the woods of California all my life, and I have never heard anything like this before. I have heard bear, mountain lion, and elk, and this was nothing like those. What impressed us was most is how loud it was. We have heard groups of humans in the campground hooping and hollering, and their noise level was not even close to this. We were inside of a travel trailer that had windows closed up, and the noise was clear and strong. We estimated that it had to have come just across the Smith River from the campground. I decided to make this report after hearing what seemed to be the same kind of sound on a recent rerun of Sightings. New to the area in July 2005, I had been traveling from Crescent City, California, over the pass of Highway 199 weekly to Grants Pass, Oregon, and back, and now in the winter of 2006, it was 2 times weekly. My wife had not joined me, and we were separated, and I was attending counseling classes in Medford, Oregon. We had about 5 children, and I had my son living with me, and he was back at home. He was about 13. This particular night, I was delayed on my return from Medford in the evening, usually arriving back in Crescent City around 12:15 a.m. It is roughly an hour from the tunnel to arrive in either Crescent City or Brookings, Oregon, where I live now. I had stopped at the bug station and rested, because I was delayed in my return, sitting with the heater on and the engine idling and doors locked. The little phone booth shack for inspections there now was not there yet. After closing my eyes about 40 minutes, I'm guessing like 12:25 a.m., I was rested and awake to get going back to Crescent City. I use my high beams because it is so dark through there, and everybody does it because, like signaling any opposite traffic of your whereabouts, everyone is usually polite to lower them upon the distance closing. I left the tunnel and traveled down the hill and began the series of S-turns through the pass. It's like a canyon and runs adjacent to various sections of the Smith River. I was slowing through the second S-turn and was watching my headlights and the shadows of the roadside barriers as they were casting the shadows in the trees along the river. My truck was an older Chevy dually with a small diesel, and it was not a powerhouse like the newer ones. I was just cruising with the turns and taking my time. It had a shell with an 8-foot bed, and it was used by a retired couple to tow their trailer, so it was kind of slow. The lights are low to the ground, and when the high beams are on, they go out further and up higher. You can be seen by anyone else, and they can see you from a ways off. As I rounded the turn and was approaching the end of the turn while watching my high beam shadows of the barricade up in the trees, I noticed this big, dark shadow cast in the trees from my lights as I rolled along and my lights lit up a giant creature walking along the opposite side, going against traffic, facing away from me. I said to myself, "Oh shit," and was very excited. The next part of the turn was coming up right away, and I immediately thought to turn around to see its face. I knew it was a Bigfoot and wanted to see its face, but I was too close still to maneuver around and go the other way, and the turn was too shallow. 1,000 things went through my mind. What does he look like? Don't turn around yet. What if he's hostile? He'll beat up my truck. Don't turn around here. The logging trucks fly through there, and my slow diesel would have to do a 3-point turn around or more to possibly get T-boned. I was excited, but also a bit scared. This was amazing. I kept telling myself, not yet. Don't turn around here. I kept looking for spots along the road to turn around, even a little room, because I really wanted to see its face. The mix of it being late, a tight turning canyon, being afraid, and also excited. I was bewildered a little. What do I do? Almost immediately, it was now the small fast S turns, very narrow, that lead to the narrow passage. It is an extremely tight through there, and you could see the tree hanging off the cliff above the roadway in the daytime, and this leads to the resort at Patrick's Creek Lodge. As I passed, I was still shaken up and thought what to do. No one will believe me. As I passed Little Jones Creek, I decided to forget about turning around because, 1, I had already seen it, and 2, it was late and no one would believe me anyhow. I did not have a regular cell phone. It was a cheap Android knockoff due to no reception, a real long startup time when turned on. So here is what I saw and why I am documenting it. It was well over 8 feet tall. I'm 6'2" and played basketball since 4th grade, even against 7-foot players in high school. I was a leaper and can jump really high. I was 6 foot when I was 12, stopping my growth at 15 years old at 6'2". I could not accurately guess the weight, but well over 400 to 500 pounds, possibly 600, 700, or even 800. He had no neck with a pointed type head buried between his massive shoulders. I'm talking huge shoulders. I was going slow enough through the turn to see his fingers, toes and palms, and foot bottoms as he walked, but his hair was like a llama, matted looking but long and longer, and shorter on different parts of his body. He was light gray to smoky charcoal gray, with some black deeper and beneath his hair, closer to his body. The hair was long on his calves, forearms, hands, and feet, so I just saw tips of long fingers. His feet bottoms were flipping tough. I'll spell it Tuff, because they were wide and what I would describe as padded. He walked swinging his arms down near his knees, but above them and upright, not hunched over like an ape. He was walking, but just massive. Those shoulders. I saw him for a good 3 to 4 seconds. His torso was longer in proportion to his legs. His leg length of thigh to calves was not as long as his upper body. He was huge. I went to work the next day and told a coworker who had lived up here for over 20 years and an avid hunter and fisherman, and he is also part Cherokee, so I knew I could trust him. He has spent countless hours elk hunting and bear hunting. He looked at me kind of silly and sloughed it up, so I shut up. You've only been up here about 8 months and you've already seen a Bigfoot? I know what I saw. After learning more and now hearing them and hearing the term Gigantopithecus, I looked it up and the tropical is the one I saw. Turn the animal around and that is exactly what was walking down the roadway. Well, this was just supposed to be a fishing trip to see what the area had to offer. I had been coming to this area for the past couple of months and started to learn it a little bit better. So, I decided to go exploring for some fishing holes. All I had with me at the time was a fishing rod and a GPS receiver so I wouldn't get lost. I parked the truck and started out on foot. I had talked to 2 local fishermen about what was in these rivers and what to use. I'm from the south, and this area was like a new world to me. So I made my way down to the river along the side of the bank. At times, the going got a little hard, but I managed. I tried several places, but the water was moving too fast. So I thought I would try and find a slack part of the river, where the flow was just a little slower. Now, these woods are a lot different than the ones I was used to, so I was a little excited about this new area. I had been walking for maybe 45 minutes and covered maybe 2 miles when I saw something off in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a stump, seeing that I had left my glasses in the truck. Now, my vision isn't that bad, but I still need them for driving. But I started to feel a little uneasy due to an earlier encounter. Plus, it might have been a bear. But, being the idiot that I am, I had to get closer. I got to within about 75 yards because I was using the tree line as cover. That was as close as I wanted to get. You could say that my heart was beating out of my chest. It was like I had buck fever. Well, now that I was within good sight of the creature, it was easy to see what it was. It finally stood up, and I didn't know up until that point how big it really was. Now, I had a roommate who was 6'7", and this creature would have easily stood over him. At the best guess, I would have to say that it was 7 feet and 6 inches tall, and it had to weigh well over 400 pounds. It finally turned to me and made me out in a second, but when it turned, it didn't run away instantly. It just stood there. I guess it was trying to see what I was. We must have looked at each other for 10 seconds or so, but it felt like 10 minutes. And in that time, all I could see was the creature had dark reddish-brown hair, and the arms easily hung down to the creature's knees. But within an instant, something spooked it. The creature turned and looked down the river, and it just took off. Now the ground that this thing covered was amazing. I didn't move for a good bit because I was in shock. After the creature had left, I did the same, once I could get my feet working again. Well, it has been a couple of years since it happened, but here goes. I was stationed in California, and I would always drive around looking for the next great fishing hole. I had been driving for quite some time and had decided to pull into Humboldt Redwoods State Park. Being from Alabama, I figured seeing these big redwoods would be kinda cool. So I got off of Highway 101 and took the Avenue of the Giants exit. Driving down the road, I was amazed at the size of the trees, so they kind of grabbed my attention. I started seeing a lot of places where I was thinking I could fish, so I started to slow down even more to find a place to park. As I kept driving, the river kind of started getting a little farther away, and I was about to turn around, when out of nowhere, something walked across the road, and to say the least, it shocked the you-know-what out of me. The reason why it got me a little jumpy was because of the fact that I had to have come within a couple of feet of this thing. Now, I'm a pretty big guy, 6 feet and about 220 pounds, but whatever walked in front of my truck had to have been well over 7 feet tall, due to the height of my truck, which is a Chevy Z71. Now, when it comes to the poundage of this thing, I would have to say it was well over 350. As far as physical features, all I saw was the back and arm swing. The thing never turned around for me to get a better look at it. But it had a large back and rather long arms. As far as the neck goes, it didn't really have one. The animal's traps made it look like it didn't have a neck, kinda like me. But after I did find a place to turn around, I went back to look around. Dumb, I know, to say the least. I only found a couple of tracks. They had to have been 14 to 15 inches long, plus the stride of this thing was a lot longer than mine. Just to make the stride this thing did, I had to make one heck of an effort. Now all I can say is whatever I saw that day was nothing like anything I'd ever seen in the woods, and I grew up in the outdoors. During the weekend of May 26th and 27th, I was conducting a sound survey project with 3 other people near the town of Johnson and the Klamath River. This area we were in had a sighting last year, around the month of July. The place where we decided to set up was a recent clear cut that ran along the hillside. It was about 1,000 feet wide and 1,200 feet long. On the edges were fir and oak trees that developed a thick cover. Running the width and centered in the clear cut was a dirt road that the local people and loggers used on a daily basis. It also provided us with a place to park and set up our sound equipment. It also became base for our team. From our base, looking down into the valley, about 2 miles, we could see the town of Johnson. From our point, we were about 1,500 feet above the river and town. Just prior to dusk, I had 2 members climb to the top of the clear cut, about 150 feet in elevation and about 300 feet away from the base. I did this so if anything was to come closer to our base camp, they would have the best field of vision, and with their night vision device would be able to determine what it was. We also had 2-way portable radios for the upper lookout and base. Manny and myself continued to set up the equipment and waited until nightfall. Because I was scheduled to participate at 10 p.m. in a live broadcast with Jeff Rent's sightings program, I was ensuring that my bag cell phone was working properly. All the equipment checked out other than the phone worked but had some static in the line. At 9:40, we started the broadcast. The sound traveled very well and seemed to echo forever. The location we were at easily helped the sound to travel well over 5 miles from valley to ridgetop and saddle. It covered a very large area. Very happy with the sound, we continued to broadcast a few more times before the sightings show started. It was almost 10 p.m. when the phone rang. It was the sightings show. The show went fine for the first few minutes, but the static was getting horrendous, cutting Jeff off completely at times. About 10 minutes into the show, Jeff asked me to try and find another location where the reception might be a little better. A commercial was playing at the time, so I quickly contacted the upper team and Manny and told them that I had to move. I started my vehicle and drove about 600 feet towards the tree line. I reconnected to the show and was relieved that it was a better connection. I was in this new location less than 15 feet to the tree line, with visibility not over 5 feet into the trees. I was parked for a few minutes and heard what I thought was a bear charging me. I am in a convertible with the window down, not much protection in anyone's mind. I looked for my revolver and it was gone. I must have forgot it with Manny when I was in a hurry to get into a better location. I sat there for a second, and again I heard this charging that sounded like a few feet away from me. This time, I started my car and got on the radio and told the upper team that I was moving out because of something charging me in the bush. Manny didn't have a radio, as we were together at base camp and had to share 2, one for base and one for the upper team. I asked the upper team, "Do you see anything?" And they replied no. I decided to wait it out, as this thing could expose itself to me, although I just realized that my camera was also with Manny. The show continued on, and I would hear footfalls, breaking branches, and at least one grunt growl. I kept asking the upper team if they could see anything, and they kept saying no. I at least had a flashlight, but didn't want to use it in fear that I would scare off whatever it was. Obviously, I was becoming very concerned for my safety, not knowing what it was, but I remained there on a chance I might be able to see a Bigfoot, or at least see something. I heard the charging again and again, and finally a crackle in the radio. "John, it's looking right at you. Can't you see it? It's about 25 feet away. That bastard is huge." My heart started pounding fast, and trying to carry on with this live program without sounding distracted was even harder. The other upper team member confirmed what they were looking at. It was something that was at least 8 feet tall, with shoulders that were 4 feet across. As I sat in my car, cell phone to one ear and the other to the forest, I could hear it charge again, and that's when they would say it went back into the trees. This happened several times. This sighting went on for several minutes, with the squatch looking at me by moving its body from side to side, trying to get a better look through the trees and brush. It was also observing moving its arms in a quick motion as if signaling to others. This whole incident, from first charge heard to the last tree branch breaking, lasted about 30 minutes. It was by far one of the most intense moments in my life. That next day, we did search the area and found the soil disturbed where this squatch was spotted. Due to the soil condition, it did not allow any prints to be left. Judging from a tree and stump in the area, it was determined that it was at least 8 feet tall, but closer to 9 feet. From the squatch's point of view, it had several windows to look at me, and by moving its body from side to side, it would have a clear view of my entire vehicle and me. At approximately 9:30 p.m., we were in the process of setting up our second tent. There were 6 of us in the party, and maintaining the campfire when, from directly across the road and meadow, we heard a type of whistle, or double whoop sound. Try whistling the syllables whew, whew, and it was immediately followed by a very intense screech, which I can only compare to a bear cub in danger, combined with the intensity of a hawk shriek. One of our younger members, who's 15, insists that it sounded like a possessed woman. Now, I grew up in the mountains of Montana, and am familiar with many animals and their sounds, and have never heard anything like this in my life. And until this moment, I have wondered what it was like to have the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I have never felt this kind of reaction. I repeat, never. The sound sequence repeated itself again, followed by a third lone screech. Immediately, we panned the forestry line with our flashlights, with the intent of at least seeing the reaction of an animal's eyes. Nothing. We must have lighted the area for nearly 10 minutes, followed the sound, and still saw nothing. As time wore on, we began to relax and go about our business of finishing the tent setup and dinner. Then, at about 12:30 a.m., just past midnight, with 2 of the teenagers already asleep, we again heard the whistle whoop, immediately followed by the screech, but this time directly behind our campsite, up the slope near the picnic areas amongst the trees. Again, we panned the area with lights. I broke out the 2 million candle power gangbuster spotlight, and it lit the night. And still nothing. No movement, no eyes, nothing. After panning around the entire area once again, I noticed movement on the road towards the restrooms, and we quickly moved the light in that direction. Walking across the road was a tiny little gray fox, or kit fox. Well, for our needs, that was our mystery animal, we thought. We figured it yelped and then made that nasty screech for some other reason. Funny, but that was enough confirmation for us, and we went to bed for the night. At approximately 5:30 a.m., 3 of us woke up at the same time, and after a minute or 2 of silence, we heard the whistle whoop, followed immediately by the intense screech, and this followed again by a lone screech. But this time, the sound was only about 20 feet from our tent, as if it was standing directly on the paved road next to our campsite. We were all unnerved somewhat, but agreed it's just that darn fox again, and didn't bother to jump up out of the video cameras or spotlights. I exchanged words with a person in the other tent, not sure if this chased it away, but we then heard the same whistle and screech again, but far off in the distance, as if it were a quarter-mile away. This was the end of our encounter. The following morning, we checked the area for any signs of tracks and found nothing. We also nearly walked the entire circumference of the lake shore, searching for signs of any kind of anything, and got nothing. We were on a long vacation from Missouri in Crescent City, California, staying at the KOA campground. This was our second night at this campground. We were camped at Site 401, way back in the isolated section of the campground, far from anyone. I had just finished cooking our supper on the portable propane barbecue pit, which was located on the picnic table. We both went inside to eat. During the time I was cooking, I set up a campfire but didn't light it yet. After we finished eating, I started the campfire. After the fire was burning for about 15 minutes, I kicked it into the fire pit from the grate. At the time, my wife got a very strong feeling that we were being watched from behind our camper. She said it seemed to move from behind the trailer, from one end to the other. There were trees and dense foliage behind the trailer. I started to look around with a flashlight to see what it was, and after not finding anything, I started the car and plugged in the 12-voltage spotlight. Looking around for about 5 minutes, I thought I saw something move in the distance, behind a tree. This was in the opposite area from the trailer, where no one was camped at all. We were both shaken up and went inside the trailer for the night. After 10 minutes, my wife heard 2 whoops coming from an area that I thought I saw something move at. She was in bed lying next to the window. I didn't hear a sound. One more thing to add is that the night before we heard the dogs bark in the distance, this night it was all quiet and no dogs at all. The closest camper was about 100 feet away towards the main office. There was no smell. It was the last weekend of September, during the fall salmon run of fishing season on the lower Klamath River in 2001. It was the end of summer, and the river was extremely low, and I just finished cleaning my salmon. It was about 10 o'clock at night, and I drove up to the river, Blake River's bar. This is where the road ends. We were sitting in my truck with the windows down when we heard a sound that I'd never heard on the river, or anywhere for that matter. My attention was immediately taken so we could hear an extremely deep howling sound that sounded something like a whoa. I was a little freaked out because I have never heard of anything like this. I remember trying to put a body with the sound and not coming up with anything. My friend and I looked at each other and said, "What the hell is that?" The hair was raised on the back of my neck, and I felt very fearful, even though I knew the thing was across the river. We waited and didn't say anything, and within about 3 seconds, we heard the same sound again. This time it went whoa, 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 3 times. It was a very deep, almost like a moaning sound. Immediately after the sound stopped, I heard the same noise, except this one sounded like it was coming up from around the corner, about a half mile, and on the other side of what is called a Turrup Flat. This one sounded more faint, because it was coming up from the other side of the densely wooded area where the river bends. It seemed clear to us that they were calling back and forth to one another. The one on the top of the river called back only twice, and the one across the river sounded off about 4 times. This entire thing only took about 20 seconds, and then it was done. I couldn't really explain what I was thinking or feeling after they stopped, but I was very shaken and just sat there for about 30 seconds, waiting to see if there was going to be any more sounds. I turned my lights on after I thought it was over, and couldn't see anything because the fog was too dense. We were both sure there had never heard any animal like this before. Between the two of us having about 60 years of night fishing and hunting in this area, this was a first. We both talked about it and felt whatever it was that they could have come from either side of the river, because the river was so low that it would have been easy to wade across there, and there wasn't little traffic in the area. The river was also very warm, and it was also full of 30 to 50 pound salmon that were heading up the river. It was a great time to fish, if that is what they were doing. Last Sunday, November 16th, 2003, my friend, my dog, and I traveled from Portland, Oregon to Northern California for some late-season backpacking. We stopped at the Aikens Creek campground, west of Orleans, California, and just west of Bluff Creek on Highway 96, at approximately 6 p.m., as it was too late to hike in anywhere that evening, and the Six Rivers NF website listed it as one of the campgrounds open through November. As we neared the big pay station, a sign deferred us to a render payment directly to the campground host, and as we approached the host site, it became clear that the site was vacant with just a few small items left behind. So we took the liberty to drive in and explore the portion of the campground that was open. Driving near the southern edge, nearest to the Klamath River, we smelt a pervasive, skunky odor, but thought nothing of it at the time. Eventually, we pulled into a campsite, which was the second or maybe third from the entrance at the foot of a large hill. Our intent was to get out of the pickup, leaving the dog inside, get on our rain gear, and set up the tent as quickly as possible, as it was already quite dark and raining. Just after donning my rain gear, however, I heard some distinct hoots from within the woodline, which were decidedly not owl-like nor human-like, but could be most accurately likened to those of an ape. I asked my friend if he had heard that, but he had not, as he had two hoods pulled up over his head. I quickly scanned the woodline with my headlamp, seeing nothing out of the ordinary through the dark and rain. We'd began setting up the tent when I heard it again. "There," I said. "Did you hear it that time?" "No," he responded, but he did pull his hoods down. Shortly thereafter, we both heard another set of hoots. "What do you think that is?" he asked. I have had casual interest in the Sasquatch phenomenon since childhood, and find its existence to be scientifically plausible. I am also quite comfortable in the wilderness, having spent much of my life in the outdoors from Alaska to Costa Rica professionally, academically, and recreationally. But I never honestly expected to experience anything firsthand with such a creature. So, being educated and reasonable, I declined to respond. As we continued, we began hearing other noises. First, we heard whacking sounds of wood against wood, more probably stick against tree. Perceiving this hooting and whacking as a less than friendly display, we became a little nervous and contemplated leaving. But curiosity and the dread of packing up, moving to an unplanned location, and reconstructing in the dark, while already soaked, compelled us to stay. So, we continued constructing the tent between periodic scans of the area. The whacking continued, and we noticed it would come from different locations in short sequences, too short for one individual to move from point A to point B. Again, my friend asked, "What do you think it is?" I gave the guarded response. "I'll tell you what, I've spent a lot of time in the woods and observed a lot of animals, but I've never heard anything like this." I assume he read through the evasion to the meaning of my response, given the ubiquitous usage of the word Bigfoot, and images thereof, in the surrounding communities and some casual conversation we had on the subject during our drive. Shortly before turning in for the evening, I heard a short series of what sounded like heavy footsteps on the rocky terrain of the hillside, and the rhythm of a two-legged walk. Turn in we did, however, with senses piqued and dogs tucked securely within the tent. We slept intermittently and restlessly, hearing sounds throughout the night. Most frequently, we heard the whacking. Most regularly, a rather hollow-sounding report originating from a point some distance to our northeast and up a hill. We would, however, periodically hear closer and clearer whacks from varying locations to our general southeast, once hearing a disturbingly close and firm whack from our southwest. I awoke once at approximately 3 a.m. and heard a distinct single-note whistle from the general direction of the distant hollow whacking, which were, again, decidedly unbirdlike, yet not quite human. Soon thereafter, we were all startled upright by a crack, followed by a loud rock slide, terminating distressingly close to our location. My friend informed me he had heard 2 other smaller slides earlier that night. After all was quiet for some time, except the perpetual whacking, we eventually slumbered down again, awakening to sunlight and finally quiet surroundings. In the daylight, we observed that the hillside was quite steep, rocky, and slightly parabolic in shape, and the rock slide ended up in our south-adjacent campsite, leading us to conclude that 1. Inspection of the hillside would be dangerous and turn up little or nothing in the way of footprints. 2. Sounds could have originated from well up the hill and carried down the amphitheater sound. If it were people playing a prank, they must be extremely dedicated to risk their lives negotiating that hill in the dark and rain, and to wait in the woods any given night for the off chance campers might come by in November. Though rock slides may naturally occur there on occasion, they certainly must not occur on the order of 3 a night, or someone would implement measures to ensure no one would camp in that location. Maybe that skunky smell we had encountered just previously was not a skunk at all. At any rate, we drove on the next morning to Willow Creek Ranger's office, making no mention of the events, to inquire as to open trails. We were instructed that much of the backcountry road system and corresponding trails was closed due to the Port Orford cedar root disease, but that we could drive into the Horse Linto Creek area and hike along the closed roads. We took that advice and spent the next 5 nights uneventfully. We decided to return to Aikens Creek for the final night, which was Saturday, November 22nd, to take advantage of the open, flat space to dry wet equipment and see if we could observe anything further. We picked an open site midway between the foot of the hill and the highway, laid out equipment for drying, then decided to day hike somewhere nearby. We drove up Bluff Creek Road to its closure at the road junction to Fish Lake, and then hiked 1.6 miles down that road. I paid close attention to the steep clay roadsides, and once noticed what could have been a partial footprint of a large, human-like foot from the heel, about 4 inches in width, to a point about 6 inches forward, and perceivably midway along the length of the foot. I found, however, no other footprints or enough context to draw any real conclusion about the impression. That night, back at the campground, we kept a large campfire and kept some down and dead cedar nearby to throw in for quick brightness if needed. At one point, my dog suddenly barked and charged toward the trees at the edge of the campground, just below the freeway. I halted him and went to investigate, but found nothing unusual. Though better prepared, we neither saw nor heard anything further that night. We returned home, however, with a new awareness. Saw a form walking upright at a distance of 200 plus yards. We were a little excited, but more like scared shitless. There was enough light to just make out whatever it was. It was moving on 2 legs. We found where it had gouged out the soft earth on the stream it crossed. No discernible footprints, but whatever made the gouge was big. We had to wild-ass guess at the length. Over 19 inches. It was longer than the tip of my extended fingers to my elbow. The grass growing across the meadow didn't allow for footprints, but was pressed down several hours later. We didn't follow the trail towards the trees. It had been watching us for around 15 minutes, give or take 5. I was asleep when my friend woke me up. Said he heard something moving above us on the exposed rock above our camp. He had his 9mm personal protection from the typical axe murderer you meet while camping in hand and was a little wound up. We listened to it move around with the occasional skip like somebody was jumping a short distance to another rock. It moved behind us and then down into the meadow that surrounded the stream we were camping on. We saw it cross the stream and slip as it went across on the other side. It moved across the meadow at a quartering angle away from us and into the tree line. We know it wasn't a bear. We had several run-ins with bears trying to get our food cache at night in Yosemite. Thought we would get away from the crowds on his backpacking trip. Good call, huh? Once we calmed down, we discussed what we think we saw. We both came to the same conclusion. I know we did not hallucinate. Our eyes had time to adjust before we finally got a visual of it moving across the meadow. We stayed awake until we had enough light to look the area over quickly, and then beat feet out of there. A friend and I went driving to camp in Oregon on Highway 199 in the fall of 1985. We didn't want to stay at a pay site, so we pulled off on a side spur road in dense forest and set up tent. We had our 2 Malamute Cross dogs with us who had been by our sides in many backcountry adventures. As we set up our sleeping bags in the tent, the dogs began growling very menacingly with the hair up full on their backs. We thought there might have been a bear around and worried that they would take off after it and be difficult to catch. We left them outside anyway and crawled into our bags to sleep. Then the dogs began whimpering and trying to claw their way into the tent. We nervously let them in, and not long afterwards began to hear howling. First, just one voice, but then followed by many voices. I would estimate that the sounds came from about 100 yards away. It was reminiscent of hearing a coyote pack or a wolf pack, but these were not canine voices. They ranged in pitch from childlike to adult male and higher female voices. It sounded like a really loud frat party in the middle of nowhere on a stormy, blustery night in the dark. It sounded like the people were talking very loud but yet howling at the same time. I've had many experiences hearing coyote packs, and this was not what I heard. I have no further explanation. We braved through the night and got the heck out of there in the morning. The second experience I had at Avenue of the Giants was the same friend while we were hiking a trail there. It was again the fall of '85, about a month later than the first. We had a map with us and decided to cut a loop short by going cross-country through the dense redwood forest. Not long after we started, the dog we had with us, same as the one of the dogs previous, lunged out full on his leash and began dragging my friend up a steep incline. We reached the top and noticed large foot-shaped impressions, maybe 14 to 18 inches long and 8 to 10 inches wide, in the depth below. Above us on the length of ground the dog drug us through. Branches were snapped off clean up to 10 feet high on the trees. We made our way back to the main trail with no further incident. On July 5th, 2004, my brother and I went on a Sasquatch expedition to the Bluff Creek area of Humboldt County, California. The first night, we stayed at Onion Lake on Onion Mountain located on Forest Service Road 13, number 1. We spent all afternoon setting up camp, taking pictures and looking around Onion Lake for Sasquatch evidence. Around 9 p.m., just as it got dark, we heard a loud grunt roar down from a hilltop just above our camp. The grunt we heard can only be described as something exhaling a great amount of air all at once. The grunt was very loud, very rough, and only lasted for a second. My brother turned to me and said, "What the heck was that?" At that moment, a deer ran down the hill from the direction of the grunt and into our camp. Then, out of the darkness, another grunt roared through the forest from our right at a distance we thought was about 100 to 150 yards out from our camp. Then we heard a grunt that strayed out from our camp that was at least 500 yards out. Then we heard the grunt from up on top of the hill again. Then the grunt to our right answered the grunt on top of the hill. And then we heard the grunt that was out 400 or 500 yards answer the grunt on top of the hill and the grunt to our right. It was as if whatever it was making these sounds were communicating back and forth to one another. This grunting was very intense for the first hour or so, but then it calmed down a little throughout the rest of the night. The last grunt we heard was around 5 a.m., just before first light. At one time around 10 p.m., we heard a loud grunt come from behind us over by Onion Lake. It turned on my 3 million candle spotlight and searched the forest in the direction we heard the grunt, but of course saw nothing. That grunt could not have been no more than 100 yards away from us, and was very loud and rough. Around that same time, the other grunts seemed to be getting closer to our camp as well, and we were starting to get scared. We huddled together in the middle of our camp with our rifles and shotguns in hand, along with our 3 million candle spotlight in hand ready to take on whatever it was making these loud grunts. We were hearing something we had never heard before in the woods, and whatever it was, it sounded like it was very big. By the sound of the grunts these things were making, we were scared. If it was not for the firearms we took with us, we would have thrown all of our camping gear into our vehicle, and we would have left a dust cloud a half-mile high and 20 miles long as we were getting ready to get the heck out of there. We got up the next morning and looked around a little bit, but we didn't see or hear anything. Whatever it was making those grunts. They were nocturnal animals, and they were only active at night. We could also tell the animals were moving around in the forest from grunt to grunt. An example would be the The grunts would get loud and would come from a specific location in the woods, and then the next grunt would come from the same general location, but a little to the right or left and a little closer or further away than the grunt before. We never did hear anything walking through the dry underbrush. Whatever they were making these grunts, they moved through the woods very quietly with no sound at all, except for their grunts. We packed all of our camping equipment into our vehicle, and we spent the next night down at a different camp on Bluff Creek. That night, we had no visitors, and we returned home to Eureka the next morning. About 1 month after we returned from our expedition to Onion Lake and Bluff Creek, I was watching a show on the Discovery Channel about ball pythons in India. A large 15-foot snake was crawling on the ground in the jungle as a family of monkeys were going crazy at the sight of the snake. These monkeys looked a lot like chimpanzees, but they had black faces and black fur. At one moment, a large male monkey made a loud grunt as he threw a stick at the snake. The grunt was very loud, very rough, and only lasted for a second. I came flying off the couch and said to myself, "That's what we heard at Onion Lake." The grunt the monkey made at the snake on the Discovery Channel was the same tone, roughness, length, and sounded exactly like the grunt we heard the night of July 5th, 2004 at Onion Lake. The Sasquatch is thought to be a large primate of some kind, and my brother and I heard loud grunts coming out of the forest at Onion Lake. These grunts I later heard a monkey make on TV in India. The monkey's grunts were identical to the grunts we heard at Onion Lake. I'm not a scientist or expert on grunts, but I think this is very interesting. My brother and I were raised here in Humboldt County, and have lived here in the heart of Bigfoot country all of our lives. We have been interested in the Sasquatch Bigfoot for as long as we can remember, and we plan on making other Bigfoot expeditions in the future, because the sounds we heard coming out of the woods at Onion Lake on the night of July 5th, 2004, makes us wonder even more now about what's really out there. I found a 3-toed footprint and a 13.5-inch footprint sometime after 6 p.m. I have plaster casts and footage of the prints before I made casts out of them. I fell asleep about 9:30 p.m. While sleeping, I was woken up to noises outside of my tent. The first noise I heard was leaves being stepped on, but I told myself it's nothing a couple of times. I began to fall back asleep when I started to hear it again, but this time it was louder and heavier. The thing that started to get to me and concern me was the fact that I had started to feel the vibration in the ground every time that it took a step. I was facing stomach down when I woke up, so I just lay there listening, and all of a sudden, the noises stopped. Whatever was out there was breaking branches on the ground, and I also heard a couple of branches breaking on the trees. Then, the noises started again. By then I was starting to get scared because, for one thing, I couldn't see outside my tent, and the other thing was that I was alone. The noises stopped, and I made up my mind to go outside. So I started to unzip the inside of the tent, and as I did, I tripped trying to get outside. By then, I got up and turned on my flashlight, spun around but seen nothing and smelt nothing. Whatever was out there didn't make any more noise, but I knew whatever it was still there. I would estimate the noise were less than 30 feet away, probably closer. That's just how close it was. I then grabbed my tent, ran with it to my truck, threw it in the back, grabbed the rest of my stuff, and I was gone. Had been riding horses with 3 other friends on the 6-hour loop trail and stopped for lunch where the outhouse is located at the one-day trail junction. We were all sitting at the picnic table having lunch and was hearing much crashing in the brush. Not unusual sounds, for there are elk everywhere in the park. We did notice, however, that a bear or something had an awfully good time with the outhouse toilet paper, as it was strung all over the place. We were all sitting there, having lunch, and I decided that I wanted to go see where the elk were, maybe see a big bull. So I got on my horse and rode down to where I heard the noise, and the trail is cut out on an old logging road, and a creek crosses through a culvert to the other side of the road, and the water forms a small pool before moving on down into the larger creek below. I could not tell you how long I was sitting there on my horse, watching this creature not more than 30 feet away, trying to get a drink of water out of the pool. It was a challenge, as the sides to the pool were fairly steep. At first, I thought it was a man, and then a monkey, and at last my brain registered what exactly I was looking at. Then I seen the fingernail, and it was black and human-like. I was looking at an adolescent, possibly baby Bigfoot. It never had a chance to turn and to look at me, as the horse I was on kept getting more and more upset the longer that I stayed there. I ran back on my horse to my friends, and told them in a stuttered manner what I had seen. Just by the way I was acting, they knew something was up, because I have been in the woods on horseback almost half of my life. They immediately followed me back to the area where I had seen what I described as a young adolescent Bigfoot. My friends did not ever see the creature though, but they heard it as it walked away and seen the ferns moving as it rustled through them on its way down the hill to the larger creek. Never heard any sounds from him or her. My friend was going to follow, and I cautioned her, because I believed that Mom was close by. The crashing in the brush we heard was not made by the adolescent-looking creature. It was made by something much larger. The creature was silver gray, had medium-length hair, like a bear, black human-like fingernails, human-like hands, I seen its thumbs, was totally covered in hair from top to bottom. I never got to see its face. It was always looking down. I never have told anyone about the sighting, and made my friends promise not to say anything for quite a while. I explained that this was a young animal, and to allow me to get this close was an experience. And if I could get that close on a horse, then someone could get that close with a gun. It was not that long after there was a news report about a son and a father seeing a Bigfoot cross the road near a local state park. The news report was just within a couple of weeks of my sighting, but I kept my sighting to myself. I am a 54-year-old man living in San Francisco. I have never had any interest in this subject until this week. An old friend of mine moved to Gold Beach, Oregon, and I was driving up to see him. I had never been on Highway 101 before, and became nervous driving on the 2-lane winding roads. I kept pulling over to let cars in back of me pass. At about 20 miles or so before Crescent City, I pulled off to allow cars go by. As I went to pull back onto Highway 101, I heard the most horrifying scream that I have ever heard. I screamed myself and ducked down on my seat. Looking up next to my Honda CR-V was a filthy-looking gorilla, the best that is I can describe it. It instantly ran into the tree line a few feet away and vanished into the dense brush. I saw it for maybe 3 or 4 seconds at a 3/4 profile. I would say it was 6.6 feet to 7 feet high, with a wedged head, and it had very dirty matted dark brown dull hair. Strangely enough, seeing the thing didn't frighten me, but the scream it gave out only a few feet from my open window almost gave me a heart attack. I never heard a noise like that, and I never want to hear it again. As a young person, I vaguely remember hearing something about a creature called Bigfoot. I suppose I thought he was something the Indians had conjured up. That is how others seem to think. Then, approximately 8 years ago, my sister gave me a book to read during a visit to Florida. I think it was called Mysteries of the Unexplained. I found it to be an interesting book, especially the story about a creature called Bigfoot. I don't remember the details, however, I do remember thinking that there is much more to this so-called myth than meets the eye. Sometime later, I saw the famous Patterson film, a film of a large, heavy, hairy, bipedal subject quickly walking away from a startled cameraman and his horse. My curiosity at this point had me wanting to find out for myself what the truth was exactly. Was this creature real, or just a never-ending series of hoaxes and grossly exaggerated stories? I was in no position at the time to set out on an expedition, so I promised myself and a few close friends that someday I would head to the northwest corner of the United States the reported home of this creature, and answer the question for myself. Years later, the opportunity finally presented itself. I started purchasing enough supplies for a 30-day solo expedition into the Northwest. Having recently read 3 books on the subject of Bigfoot, I thought my best bets were either Washington State, Oregon, Northern California, or Idaho. Sightings were consistent in and around large forests of these states. While purchasing supplies, I picked up the August issue of a camping magazine that, as it turned out, contained an article about backpacking in Northern California. The article stated that you are more likely to see Bigfoot in the forest of this region than another human being. I took the article seriously. Northern Cali, here I come. At this point, I had read enough material to have a plan that I was confident would bring me face to face with one of these creatures. My plan was to not go after one. It was to give one the opportunity to come to me. I just had to put myself in its backyard. As I made my way into the northwest corner of the state, I realized I wasn't going in for a casual stroll through a forest. This forest was thick with undergrowth and either going almost straight up or straight down. 1 week into my hike into the backcountry, I decided to change my plan. After reflecting on conversations I'd had with the locals, I decided to turn around and head for an area about 25 miles from where I was now standing. The people that had talked openly with me about Bigfoot activity all mentioned geographical locations that were in the same general vicinity. They also said that there hadn't been any activity there in the past 10 or so years. After making my way to this new location, I met a man that had lived there for the past 30 years. He said pretty much the same thing everybody else said. I had come to the right place, but I was about 10 years too late. He then pointed to a spot on my map that, the best of his recollection, was an area with many footprints and supposed sightings that had been reported over a decade ago. That would be my final destination. At this point, my feeling that a Bigfoot was no longer in this immediate area was growing somewhat stronger. I considered the possibility that Bigfoots had lived here at one time and now lived elsewhere due to the logging activity in this valley some 10 to 30 years ago. The forests of this area are large enough to play hide and seek with the entire United States Army. Dense forest covers the land further than the eyes can see, and these creatures could be anywhere in it. I pressed on. As I made my way toward my final destination, I continued to look for signs of something big and heavy, leaving some kind of marks on the earth. If they were still around, I should find something. I came across what looks like a bedding area for a creature that could fit a Bigfoot's description. It was a bowl-like depression in the ground, about 8 feet in diameter. Everything within this circle was flattened. It was only 15 feet from a stream. Convenient, I thought. There was also what looked like a large print on the side of this bowl, headed toward the water. Many small to medium-sized trees in the immediate vicinity were bent over or broken off at the base. It all fit, but it could be a bear's resting place, I thought. I left without bothering to take a picture. The same day, I followed an old logging road to a point that it turned into a poor excuse for a rabbit trail. Along the way, I found 3 depressions, about 14 inches long and 7 inches wide, in the soft, mossy-like growth between 2 old fallen trees. It appeared to be 3 steps taken by a very large and heavy bipedal animal. Coincidence, I thought, and pushed on. By this time on my trip, I had seen several bear, a couple of deer, and 2 mountain. Their tracks were all over the place, especially bear tracks. Bear excrement was also in great abundance. This put me at ease. The better they were eating, the less they would be interested in what I was eating. Blackberries are abundant in August, and from the looks of the scat, it appeared the bears were taking full advantage of this. Visibility was about 10 to 50 yards through the trees. Some of the noises that had been around me on a regular basis were bear and deer that I could not see because of the poor visibility. At the start of this expedition, I would reach for the pepper spray at the mere sound of a couple squirrels playing in the leaves. This behavior was probably due to the fact that a bear had wanted to join me for dinner the very first evening I was in the bush. I'll never forget the sound of him coming towards me through the forest. From that point forward, I was well aware that I was carrying approximately 40 pounds of bear bait, 30-day food supply, on my back. As my time in the woods progressed, so did my ability to guess what animals were around me by the sounds they made in the brush. Given the opportunity, my eyes would usually confirm what my ears had told me. Since I was on foot, and usually on a logging road, I sometimes got extremely close to animals before they realized I was there. One time I had walked within 35 feet of two bear, not on purpose, that were feeding off to the side of the logging road. They never heard, saw, or smelt me. Anyway, I reached my destination and made camp at the intersection of 4 logging roads. It was now almost 2 weeks into my expedition. My plan was to recon the 3 logging roads that led down to a river. If I could get to the river, I might find some nice fresh Bigfoot tracks in the sandy banks along the water's edge. I checked out the east road that evening. No luck. It dead-ended about a quarter mile from the river, just like the forestry map showed. I went back to camp, ate dinner, set out a chem light, and hit the tent. I put the chem light out in hopes of deterring bear from casually strolling into my little area of operation. The night passed without incident. I slept like a log. How appropriate. The next morning I checked out the north road. Success. It led right down to a nice open field next to the river. The map I was given by the National Forest Service showed it to be dead-end about half a mile short. I'm glad I checked it out. I thoroughly checked the southern bank of the river. No tracks. The northern bank was covered with heavy growth, and therefore I did not plan on crossing to check it out. No tracks, and I was sure this was the place that had stirred up much of the controversy some 10 to 30 years ago. As I stood in the field and looked back towards the forest, I decided to check all around the field. I started at the west end. Almost immediately after starting this new search pattern, I came across a depression similar to the ones I had recently seen but didn't pay too much attention to. Again, there was no detail because of the type of ground. It was a bigger and deeper depression than I thought a man or bear could ever make. I looked further, and there was one other one, and then another. This time, I was sure these were tracks because there were about 7 of them strung together in the pattern of a natural bipedal walk. I walked in the tracks. The bottom of the depressions were very hard, as though something of great weight had made them last time this ground was wet. The distance between the steps was not extraordinary, at an average of about 3 feet apart. I lost the track momentarily over hard ground and then found it again. It was a consistent track. I figured I was tracking him. I say him when all actuality it may be a her. The opposite direction he was walking, judging from the shape of the tracks. It was now time for something to happen that I had never considered or read about in any book. I followed the tracks through a soft section of ground to the base of a 50-foot tall pine tree. At the base of the pine tree was an area of ground that looked as though it had been trampled down repeatedly by this same heavy creature. It was at that very instant that I realized he had been leaning against a tree. Then it occurred to me that if he was leaning against this bark and sap-covered tree, there must be hair stuck to it. I moved my face closer, and there it was. From a level of about 3 to 6 feet off the ground, hair was stuck in crevices and tree sap. I collected some samples and then stood in the same place that this creature had stood, with my back against a tree. I couldn't help but notice the nice view of the open field next to the river he might have enjoyed while standing in that position. The surface of my back from my buttocks to the area between my shoulder blades naturally was against the tree. If this creature did not put his head against the tree, as I did not do, then I guessed that I was about 2 feet shorter than the Bigfoot that had rested against this tree. I am 5'10". After collecting the hair samples from the tree, I continued to track. I had only gone another 20 yards when I found a similar trampled down area at the base of another pine. This pine, however, was much younger, and the top had been broken off at a height of about 6 feet. The top was lying off to the side. As I looked closer, I noticed that all of the branches on the side of the tree directly over the trampled down area were either bent back and to the side or broken off entirely. Hair was all over this tree as well. This creature wasn't really resting against the tree. He was scratching his back. I continued the track and only gone about another 15 or so feet when I found another young pine that was in the same condition as the one I had just inspected. The top had been broken off at about 6 foot level also. More broken and bent branches, with the telltale hair stuck in the bark and sap. This creature had a definite itch. Since I was tracking him backwards, I guessed that he must have tried to rid himself of this itch on the 2 small trees. They probably weren't sturdy enough to satisfy him, so he made his way over to the large pine and finished the job. The tops of the small pines that I found lying on the ground still had a small percentage of green needles, with the majority looking brown and dying. I don't know enough about trees to make an educated guess as to how long the tops had been broken off. I ventured to guess that it was no longer than a month before I stood in the very same spot. Wow, he had been through here quite recently, I thought to myself. For some reason, I thought he had just been passing through and was no longer in the area. He had been here, but was long gone into another valley. Looking back, I am not quite sure I didn't think he was still around. Maybe it was because I wasn't finding any fresh tracks. I continued tracking him for another 300 yards or so. He was about as hard to track as an elephant through a cornfield. The tracks led to the edge of a thick forest undergrowth, at which point I decided to terminate my efforts. Looking back over the area I had tracked, I realized he had stayed just inside the edge of the woodline the whole way. A smart Bigfoot, I thought. Unlike the bear and deer that were leaving their tracks all over the place in the wide open field. As I started to circle back around the east of this large open field next to the river, I come upon a large pile of excrement. It looked human except for the fact it was a very large pile, and the contents were plant-like. As I mentioned earlier, I had seen a lot of bear dung, and this looked quite different. Tracks led up to and then appeared to straddle this dropping. Again, this was not best ground for holding a track. However, it did look as though the tracks were made by a large, heavy, bipedal Bigfoot. I collected a large sample of the excrement and put it in a plastic baggie. At this point, I was feeling pretty good about what I had found and satisfied that this had been a successful expedition, even if I wasn't going to see a Bigfoot. I had hair and excrement samples, good physical evidence that a Bigfoot is still roaming these woods. I looked around some more and found 2 more of the same types of piles, fairly close to the first one. I remember thinking that this must have been his bathroom. He probably would feed at night, get a drink from the river, and then relieve himself here. If this was being done by a Bigfoot, then he seemed to be the creature of habit. By this time, I had been down by the river for a good few hours. I headed back to camp, which was located about 2 miles up the road. After dinner, I decided to go ahead and recon the west road, which was the last logging road I had to check out. It came to a dead end, just as the east road had. As I was making my way back to camp, before the mosquitoes set in, I noticed something I did not see on my way out. On the north side of this old logging road stood a young pine tree that had been topped at a point about 6 feet above the ground. I immediately looked down at the base of the tree and saw what I knew what I would see. The large trampled down area of ground. Those big padded feet had stood right there. I then saw the tracks leading up to the tree, as well as the top of the tree lying on the ground off to the side. This time I closely inspected the broken off top of the tree and found hair stuck on it. Hair most likely from the side of the hand that broke it off. I must add at this point that I was keeping a lookout for claw marks in the tracks and teeth marks on the broken off treetops, which would most likely have been left behind if a bear had done this. I was paying attention to this for not only myself, but for the people that would ask me about it later, when this expedition was all done. I had no doubt what was doing this, and it was not a bear. Anyway, I didn't find a trace of either claw or teeth marks. This time I kept the broken part of this little pine with hair intact in the sap and put it in a plastic baggie. It seemed as though this creature had a habit of preparing these small pines for back-scratching posts in an intelligent and consistent manner. I wondered if other Bigfoots did this. I completed my journey back to the tent and realized that the pine I had just collected the samples from was only about 100 yards away. If the other depressions I had seen on the way into this area were indeed tracks, as I thought they could be, then Bigfoot was leaving too much evidence around here to just be passing through. I figured I was camped right smack in the middle of a Bigfoot's backyard. I had gathered about 3 cords of firewood in the course of the day, which I now started using to stoke up a pretty good-sized campfire. The wood burned quickly because of the fact that it was very old and dry. About every 20 minutes or so, I would have to put on another log. This kept the fire at just under the bonfire setting. Darkness fell without incident. No bears, no mountain lion, and no Bigfoots. Wow, if my friends could see me now, Bigfoot bait. Every few minutes or so, I would look up to the west logging road, and then up the east logging road. The north and south avenues of approach were covered by a very heavy brush. I could hear a lizard coming toward me from either of those directions, so I wasn't too concerned about them. Actually, it would have to be a pretty large lizard to be heard over the snap, crackle, and pop of my campfire. I passed some time by sharpening the ends of my walking stick. I got a chuckle out of the fact that my walking stick was about 3 feet longer than the one I had started with. The further away from civilization I got, the softer and the bigger the stick I carried. Everything I had read and heard about Bigfoots told me they were not as aggressive unless shot at. Since I had no gun, that wasn't a problem. However, I did keep the pepper spray ready at all times, just in case. I also tried to stay aware of which direction the breeze was blowing, because into it, the pepper spray had a maximum effective range of only about 2 feet. I continued to look up and down the 2 logging roads. My campsite was surrounded by complete darkness. I looked at my watch. It was 11 p.m. If I didn't see anything by 1 a.m., I would hit the tent for a good night's sleep. A Bigfoot could be miles from here. Time dragged on as I occasionally looked up and down the 2 roads. I was sitting on a short log, set in an upright position at a distance of about 5 feet from the fire. My back was to the fire so that it wouldn't impede my vision as I scanned the surrounding darkness. I looked into the darkness of the west road and then looked into the darkness of the east road. That is when it happened. The hair on my back and neck stood straight up. It was the strongest instinctive reaction I have ever had in my life. I was looking directly into a pair of eyes that were looking directly at me. I didn't move a muscle. It was Bigfoot. There was no doubt in my mind that what I was looking at was not a bear, mountain lion, owl, or deer. His eyes were set wide apart and well above where I knew the ground should be. I didn't take my eyes off them. The Oma, as called by the local Indians, was watching me. Something that I had not spent much time thinking about until right at that moment was now a prime concern to me. Had anyone ever taken a shot at this creature? Did this creature, for whatever reason, hold any sort of grudge against human beings? I hope not. Actually, it was more like a quick prayer. I did not want him to direct any ill will towards me at all. It most likely would have been about 750 pounds of powerful ill will. He wasn't moving though. I wasn't moving either, even though my neck was crooked to the left in an uncomfortable position. I watched him and he watched me. The longer I looked into his eyes, the more I got the feeling that this was just an intelligent and lonely creature, curious to see what I was doing. I began to relax. I had a mini-mag flashlight in my left hand and the pepper spray in my right. I wondered if I should shine the flashlight on him to get a look at his body. Again, I should point out that this could have been a female, but for the sake of simplicity, I will continue to refer to the creature as he. I opted not to shine the flashlight on him, and he came to me. I saw him, and now the ball was back in his court. I waited for him to make the next move. His nocturnal eyes were reflecting the light of the fire I was sitting next to. I tried to make the outline of his body, but I could not. The campfire illuminated bushes and trees out to a certain distance, depending on how recently I had put up a fresh log. Beyond that point of illumination, the forest was pitch black. I believe the fire was at a point that a fresh log had just been added when I first looked up and saw a Bigfoot. I continued to observe. The right eye, his left eye, occasionally seemed to fade in and out as though it was partially blocked by a leaf or branch of the bush I was sure he was standing behind. Earlier at times when I really had the fire going, the front of this bush would be illuminated for the period of time that the fire was brightest. I couldn't see the bush now, but I was sure of its position. As I studied his eyes, I got the impression that they were wet. Liquidy, you might say. An effect probably caused by the flickering of the fire they were reflecting. They were a glossy yellow when I first saw them and faded to a real faint yellow, almost white, toward the end of our strange staring session. Looking back, I would guess that while paying complete attention to him, I had neglected the fire, and as the fire lessened in intensity, so did his eyes. Occasionally it looked as though he would blink. His eyes would simultaneously disappear for a fraction of a second. It also looked as though his head was shifting from side to side. Similar, I thought, to what I would do if I was trying to observe someone from behind a bush. His eyes looked to be approximately 4.5 to 5 inches apart, and almost 1 inch in diameter. Minutes ticked by, and my neck was beginning to get sore from the position I was sitting and watching him as he watched me. I casually looked at my watch. It was now 12:15 a.m. Then I slowly raised and extended my left arm for the purpose of using my hand as a measuring tool. He didn't move while I did this. He just kept watching. I used the width of my left hand to measure the distance from his eyes to the top of a lone pine silhouette against the night sky in the background. I made a mental note that his eyes were almost directly under and 2 hand widths below the tip of the lone pine. I also made a mental note not to move the log I was sitting on for the rest of the night. I would use this information when the sun came back up. After making these observations, I decided to relieve the soreness in my neck and look up at him from another position. I slowly spun around in one direction away from him. I didn't want him to think I was getting ready to confront him. I looked up and he was still there watching me. I remember wondering if he could tell I was watching him. The fire was now slightly behind and to the left of me. From his vantage point, I was most likely now just a silhouette by the fire. His eyes were now getting harder to see. They were there, but not as bright. My eyes were getting sore from staring, and then I noticed how dark it was getting in my camp. The fire had barely a flame left to flicker. It didn't take me long to decide that I wasn't going to sit there in complete darkness with a Bigfoot just spitting distance away. I slowly stood up to get another log from the pile that was just out of reach. I positioned the log in the fire and sat back down. When I looked up, I could not find his eyes. He was gone. At about 3:15 a.m., I thought I could see his eyes again, but in a position further back from where he had stood the first time. I was kind of expecting him to come back and see what I was up to. It was hard to tell if he did or not, but I think he did. Time passed slowly as I waited for the sun to come up so I could check for tracks. I thought about doing it with a flashlight, but rejected the idea. I would see things much more clearly in the morning. As the sun came up, I sat in the same position I was in when I had measured his eyes from the top of that lone pine tree. According to how everything lined up, his eyes would have been centered at the top of the 8-foot bush that stood about 70 feet away from where I had been sitting. When it was light enough to see the ground fairly well, I made my way over to the area behind the bush. It was an area that was just to the side of the logging road. The ground was similar to the logging road itself, which was hard-packed gravel. The difference was that the area where I figured a Bigfoot should have been standing was covered in a dry, sparse, wheat type of grass. There they were, the same size tracks I had been finding all along. The tracks were not much more than the grass being squashed, and I do mean flattened in the shape of a big, padded foot, narrower at one end than the other, and approximately 16 inches long and 7 to 8 inches wide at the front of the track. There was a set of tracks leading to a point exactly behind the bush, where they then became less distinguishable, as though he had been shuffling around. There was, however, one depression in the ground at a point close to the bush. I guess it would have been his right foot that made it by its shape. I stood there where it looked as though he had stood and found myself directly behind the bush. I looked up to see that it was about 2 feet taller than my eyes would have been at bush top level. There was another set of tracks that led away at a slightly different angle than the set that had led in. He had come in and left on the east logging road, nice and quiet. No crashing through the forest. At this point, I thought to look for a hair sample around the tracks in hopes of later matching it with the samples I already had. I got down on my stomach and looked. Nothing. I quickly looked over the logging road for more tracks, but didn't find anything. It was very hard-packed. Decision time. Do I stay camped here and hope to see a Bigfoot in the daytime? This is when I realized I had taken too many pictures the day before, and I did not have any more film for the camera. Last time that ever happens. Anyway, Bigfoot is nocturnal, and daytime sightings are extremely rare. He would have probably be somewhere very well hidden and fast asleep during daytime hours. As I mentioned earlier, my plan was to stay 30 days in the bush. But now that I had the hair, excrement, and tree samples as well as the pictures of the tracks and the experience of last night, I decided 2 weeks was long enough. I packed everything up and headed out on the east logging road. I was walking at a pretty good pace, having 17 miles to cover before nightfall, with about 60 pounds worth of gear still in my rucksack. I didn't want to waste any time. I'd only gotten about 75 yards up the logging road when I heard what sounded like an extremely large animal thrashing in the woods at a point next to where I was walking. The noise was so close that I didn't even think I was going to get the pepper spray in time I wore on my left arm out of its holder in time to use it. Then I realized it was running away from me, crashing through the woods. I think best describes it. Large branches snapping as it escaped my nearness. As I listened to its escape, I tried to figure out what it was. It covered a lot of ground very, very quickly. Through the process of elimination, I started guessing. The list of possibilities was short because there are not many animals large enough to have possibly made that much noise. The speed suggested a deer, but there was no snorting or hoof sounds that I had previously heard from deer running away from me, nor did the animal in question sound as fleet-footed as a deer. The feet were crunching, a lot of material underneath them, suggesting that they were large surface extremities. Could it have been a bear? Possibly, but all the bear I had dealt with to this point were not that afraid of anything. The creature in question was also running away from me on the downhill side of the road, and it is my understanding that bear don't run downhill too well. Things happened very quickly, which made it hard to tell, but it also sounded as though the creature I had heard was not getting away from me, but in a four-legged gallop. There is one thing I am sure of. The noise I had heard was caused by an extremely large and powerful creature that desperately did not want to be that close to me. I will venture to guess that my old buddy had stayed pretty close to me the whole night, and may have even been watching me for the next morning. I call him that because I felt as though we had somehow bonded during my long look into his eyes that night by the campfire. I had seen his soul, and it was a kind soul. My question had been answered. This was in July of 1997. My friend and I were backpacking in the Redwood National Park, north of Eureka, on a particular trail in the national park. We started hiking at about 3 in the afternoon and hiked for a few hours. Then we walked off the trail up into a small canyon for about half a mile and made camp. We found bear tracks, started to get worried, so we hung our food from a tree. About this time, 7 o'clock, we heard the first scream. It was short and didn't repeat. We started to get a little freaked out, so we started a fire and heard nothing for the next 3 or 4 hours. Then, at about 10:30, maybe 11 p.m., the screaming started again, this time lasting for about 10 minutes. It sounded like it was about half a mile away, on one of the surrounding ridges, a very eerie wail. It didn't sound human. I know what elk, coyote, and wolf calls sound like, and this was nowhere near. Very similar to recordings I've heard of supposed Bigfoot calls. We went to bed at about 2 a.m. and left the next morning without incident. I have spent a lot of time in the woods. I was a climber for 10 years, and I have heard it all out there. This was different. I was with my sons. We all wanted to camp in a Bigfoot area, so we went to a campground near Bluff Creek. We were all in the tent and in our bags. The camp had settled down, and all of a sudden, there was a whoop. They were loud as if behind us in succession. Whoop, whoop. And it seemed that they were more than one. I estimate 3, one to the left of us, one behind us, and one off in the front at a distance. Also, something either took a large step or jumped off something, and it was big. The one behind us would call first, and the one off in the distance would call back. The one to the left would whoop once, but the one behind would whoop 3 times, and the others once or twice. At the start of the whoops would be almost a pucker or click sound. I figure the one behind us was the lead because he would call out and they would answer. After about 10 minutes, the lead creature started to move off with one to the left towards the other. I wanted to look out the tent, but my youngest was with me, who was 6 and was real scared because the calls were just so loud. I stayed with him and did not get to look till it was over. I found no evidence in the morning, but earlier that day, I noticed there were markings on a tree that was not made by a bear, almost as if the bark had been picked off. I have always followed this phenomenon and believed there was a possibility. This solidified everything. On July 13th, or August 17th of 2000, about 7:15 p.m., my boyfriend, my 2-month-old baby, and I were headed back from Eureka, California, to Crescent City, California. Somewhere past Trinidad, and right before the lagoon, we came around the corner on a 4-lane highway. Up ahead, around 50 yards away, a tall, dark brown, almost black man with long hair all over ran full stride across the highway. His arms hung long, and the top of his neck seemed somewhat hunched over. The first thing that ran through my mind was, what's a man doing running across the road right here? I thought this because we were completely out in the middle of nowhere. Then I yelled, "That was a Bigfoot!" My boyfriend turned to me and said, "Shut up, you're playing with me." I told him that he saw it with his own eyes. By this time, we had passed the point where he ran across the road into the forest, so we stopped and turned around. We drove back to the point where we had re-entered the forest and stopped. Peering into the thick forest, it became too spooky for me, and I drove off. I noticed where and when he chose to cross the road was very unique. He waited until there were no cars except for ours, which caught him off guard, just coming around the corner, and where he crossed was flat. It was the only place throughout the woods that didn't have a little hill on either side of the highway. Some of the people I have told this to ask if it was a bear, but there is no way it could have been a bear at the speed that this thing ran. My neighbor is a seasonal wildlife biological technician for Redwood National Park. He has been working several seasons doing spotted owl surveys and is very familiar with local wildlife. One evening just before sunset, he and his partner were walking with a cage of 6 mice that had sat in the same cage without being cleaned for 3 or 4 days, and it smelt to high hell. They were several miles south of Bald Hills Road at about 2,000 feet up, an approximately 3,000-foot mountain, in extremely rugged and isolated terrain, several miles from the nearest logging road. After bushwhacking for about 30 minutes, heading downhill, they stopped in their tracks when they heard a large branch snap. There are a lot of bears and mountain lions in the area, and they are familiar with the stalking cats. The creature was quick and agile like a cat, but sounded heavier than a bear. It also sounded like it was walking on two legs. They would hear it behind them, and a little later, it would be way ahead of them, sometimes on the other side of them. They figured it was crossing right behind them, and then passing them up on the other side. By this time, it was getting dark in the forest, late twilight, when my friend started looking over his shoulder quite frequently. It was at this time that he saw a large dark animal dash across their trail on two legs. He has seen the PG film and is familiar with Sasquatch, and he says that it moved with the same motion, just much quicker. He also noted it seemed a little thinner than Patty.